Ukraine has started a conversation with the countries of the Global South. This conversation is difficult, but it is opening up new prospects for understanding. What do we still lack to better understand each other? The UkraineWorld podcast invites you to a conversation at the UkraineWorld discussion, Ukraine, South Africa, India, how can we better understand each other? The conversation took place in Kyiv at Pan-Ukraine Space on May 2nd, 2024. Our guests are Damon Galgut, a South African writer, winner of the Booker Prize in 2021 for his novel The Promise. His work has been translated into 35 languages. And Anjan Sundaram, an Indian author, journalist and academic, winner of 2015 Frontline Club Prize for his war reporting from the Central African Republic. Sundaram also received a Reuters Environmental Journalist Prize in 2006 for his reporting from the Democratic Republic of Congo. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm a Ukrainian philosopher, chief editor of UkraineWorld and president of Pan-Ukraine. Before we start, let me remind you that UkraineWorld is brought to you by Internews Ukraine, one of the largest Ukrainian media NGOs. You can support our work at patreon.com/UkraineWorld. You can also support our volunteer trips to the front lines of this war at PayPal, ukraine.resisting@gmail.com. You can find these links in the description of this episode. So, let's start. Hello, dear colleagues. We will start our conversation today, and thank you so much for being here. This is our attempt to talk, to make these bridges between Ukraine and other countries of the world, not necessarily those countries we are very often talking with. We can be talking about Global South, or maybe be more precise, and I hope that we will talk about this today a lot. This is an event of Pan-Ukraine and UkraineWorld within the program of Pan-Ukraine Solidarity with Ukraine, within which we are bringing a lot of different and very interesting people from all around the world. And this is not just, they're coming not just to talk with us, they're coming to see what is happening, and they're traveling across Ukraine and to the former war zones, in particular in Kyiv Oblast and Chernihiv Oblast. And today we wanted to talk, probably some of you were here some time ago, and we had a conversation about India and Ukraine. Today we are going rather to talk more about African continent and the way how we can make these bridges between Ukraine and in particular South Africa, but not only. And of course India will also be on our radars. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm president of Pan-Ukraine and chief editor of UkraineWorld. I'm also very, very happy that a representative from South African Embassy is here with us, Mr. Motusi Chuanene, the first secretary of the embassy. Thank you so much for being here. And let me introduce our guest. Damon Galgut is a South African author and winner of the Booker Prize in 2021 for his novel The Promise. And I hope that we will talk a little bit about this novel as well, because this novel is very personal. It talks about many issues that connect the national history and the family histories. Thank you very much, Damon, for being here. And you're an acclaimed writer, and lots of people know you around the world. And of course, not every day that a Booker Prize winner is coming to Ukraine. Thank you. Please welcome. And we have Anjan Sundaram, who is an Indian author, journalist, and academic. And Anjan is interesting because he's obviously connected with India, born in India, but studied in the United States at Yale, but then became a war journalist. And I admired listening to him talking about Central Africa. And as Anjan repeats all the time in his interviews, Central Africa is a country, not a region. You also worked in Congo, right? You also worked in Rwanda. You spent, I think, 5 years in Rwanda. Now you're living in Mexico. So you're a citizen of the world, we can say. So you see that perspective that we have here in this conversation. I hope it will be very going through different regions and different problems. And our key task is to connect our experience, make these bridges, because this is probably the most important thing. We know so little about each other, and it's so great that you came here. We have also among our public two other authors from South Africa, and I hope we'll be also able to bring them in the discussion. So, Damon, my first question will be to you, and maybe Anjan will also add to this. You came here today. You visited Yahidne, which is a village in Chernihiv Oblast, and we always bring our guests to this place, which is probably not the most horrible place of the Russian invasion, but maybe one of the most telling. It tells so much how the Russian army was dealing with the Ukrainian citizens. To remind you, over 300 people were put into the basement of the school and kept there for 28 days. Tell me first, what came into your mind when you received the invitation to come here? Why you said to yourself and to your family that, look, I'm going to Ukraine, and what have you learned already during these trips, and in particular during today's conversation with people in Yahidne?
Firstly, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation to be here at all. I should probably preface everything I say today by telling you that it will take some time to process and digest the things I've seen. I find it very hard to come up with a snap formulation immediately after witnessing anything at all. The decision to come here was not without certain inner conflict. I won't go into all the yes, but questions that went through my mind. I think ultimately it came down to a feeling that a gesture of solidarity was important enough for me to make the journey. And for me, solidarity in this situation means putting yourself for a very brief time into the same position as the other people who are living through this experience. So everything I've seen, it's been a very short visit, much too short in some ways. Everything I've seen has added to that. It's one thing to understand a situation in an abstract way through journalism. It's something else completely to stand on the ground where these events happened and to feel in an almost sensual way how it must be to be a human being living through these events. One's imagination is a limited organism. It's one of the reasons we need novelists, I think, is to fire up the imagination, but it certainly fired mine up. So yeah, it's an inadequate reply, but it's what I can offer you. I mean, the one thing I took away from this morning's visit was a thought that if you're put into prison, solitary confinement is usually conceived of as the worst possible punishment. But what became very, very clear today is that to be in a small space with far too many people is an equally, if not more, horrifying ordeal to live through.
Thank you, Damon. I would also add that in our literature, and probably I brought it already once, in our literature we have a moment, and I mentioned in particular a novel by Ivan Bahriani, who is our great writer. In one of his famous novels, the Gethsemane Garden, which is obviously reference to Christianity and to Christ, there is a description when a prisoner, well, the main character, was put in a singular cell with 28 other people. And it was already described, because this was a practice of the empire, and I have this impression that this is a typical practice of the empire. Empire has lots of space, but then it says to each particular citizen, you don't deserve this space. You should, be deprived of this space. And maybe deprivation of this space, of the personal space, is one of these elements when a person is deprived of dignity, right?
Well, yeah, because aside from anything else, whatever suffering you go through is not private at all. It's witnessed at very close confines by people who are suffering in exactly the same way. I can only imagine what that must feel like, never having been in such a situation. But yeah, it was for me a very, it evoked a sensation of almost pure horror, actually.
Anjan, let me address to you. In one of your interviews, you are saying how you were a student at Yale, and then you were reading New York Times, I think, or another American newspaper, and you suddenly came across a very short article about the war in Congo and 4 million people dead, and you asked yourself why such a horrible news got such a little place in the newspaper, and that basically motivated you to become a war journalist and go to Congo. Is this the reason? And you describe your war reporting as in many cases the work of empathy, the way how you have this empathy towards people. Is this the reason why you at a certain moment said to yourself, okay, I will go to Ukraine?
Oh, thanks. Thanks again also for the invitation. I should say that there are a couple of things that, at the outset, I kept reading in the news that Russia, for example, was expelling journalists. And so I thought it was interesting that Ukraine and PEN Ukraine was inviting us. And I have to say also that our experience here, my experience, and I think our collective experience here has been, we've been left on our own to formulate our opinions and ideas about what's going on quite freely, with very little interference, which I think is a hard thing to do. Every interview, every meeting that we've had, we've been here for a week now, Maxime and Anna, who've been with us from PEN, they've sat quietly even through all our questions, sometimes critical questions, all kinds of questions. I think it's quite difficult to do, to leave us alone. And so that's been something actually very pleasant and very helpful for us. I guess I was, in addition to this opportunity to, experience some part of this conflict, because I'm a war reporter, because I'm often in conflict situations, I was also curious how this, situation compares to the other conflicts that I report on. Like you said, the Ukraine war has been on the front pages a lot. I was, also curious to understand. You mentioned before we came here to speak this sort of global South cooperation. So how countries in the global South perceive the needs of other countries in the global South, how there can be cooperation. All of these questions, I think, made it and made me curious and made me want to come along on this, accept the kind invitation.
You describe your experience in Central Africa as an experience being at a country nobody knows about, and your editors even saying that Central Africa, what is it? Is it a country? And I just wanted to ask one very delicate question, because I have the feeling that people in the Middle East or maybe on African continent, they are thinking that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is too much covered compared to their wars. And there is a certain feeling of injustice. I have this feeling, and I have confirmation from the people I talk to. And my response to this is that, look, but we went through this total silence. And we have the moment in our history of the Great Famine of Holodomor, at least 4 million people dead in 32, 33, that nobody was talking about in the world. And even papers like New York Times were covering this. I mean, covering in the sense that they were lying about this. They were not talking about this. And we came through this silence, and maybe this is one of the reasons of this war, because Russia was thinking that, okay, but nobody cares about Ukraine. Everybody was silent about Ukraine for centuries, so nobody will notice that Ukraine disappears. And this was something that didn't work out. And maybe this should be also our, I don't want to say message, but also our kind of gesture to these countries that suffer from the lack of attention and lack of empathy, that look, guys, we understand your pain. We Ukrainians understand your pain, and but at some moment you will have your voice too, and it is worth struggling for that.
I think that's exactly my impression as well. I was surprised, actually, in many of our meetings, the people we spoke with mentioned Syria, mentioned South Africa, mentioned India, and I was surprised to hear these countries named, because often in these conflict scenarios, the West is seen as kind of a savior. Only the West can save us, and of course there's an element of that. Ukraine needs weapons, and most of those weapons are coming from Western countries. But there's also, besides the physical war, there's also an informational war. And Russia has shown itself to be very strong at misinformation, not just here, but in the US and many other countries. And so in this information war, I've seen many Ukrainians mention Global South countries as key partners. And that surprised me. And so I asked a couple of them, how and why. And I think my conclusion was exactly as you say. Many of the countries that I've reported on, the conflicts also are similarly, or receive even less attention. Huge war crimes that don't receive justice, just as we've seen over the last 2 days, during our excursions from Kyiv. And I think if Ukraine's success will be the success of these other countries as well. I think as much as Ukraine is able to take these court cases to the international justice system, get some kind of redressal, some kind of justice for it, I think it will only inspire hope, because there's a strong sense of hopelessness in many of the places that I've reported on, sense that their conflicts, their concerns, crimes against them are not even witnessed, even less addressed through some mechanism of justice in the international system. I think what you say resonates a lot.
Damon, I want to ask you about your country, about South Africa. You wrote this novel, The Promise. Correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I was able to learn, is one of the key topics is the promise to give a piece of land from a white family to the black woman who was taking care of one of the members of the family, and the promise was not fulfilled. And this is your description of this apartheid or post-apartheid society, where the white community and the black community are real enemies, and there is a big of suppression from the white community of the black community. And this also provokes in you the sentiment of distance towards your country, and even hatred towards your country, towards this injustice. Why I'm asking? Because I think for many Ukrainians, the experience of the Soviet Union is the same. So this experience that you hate your motherland, in quotation marks, because it is so cruel to yourself or to others. Can you elaborate on this a little bit?
Yeah, I'm not sure I would talk in terms as absolute as hate. Firstly, I don't think it's the case that black and white South Africans necessarily hate each other. It's that they are very divided from one another, to the extent of looking at each other across a huge gulf. A gulf that should have closed by now, incidentally. We're 30 years into democracy, and yet the apparent shape of apartheid is still there, because essentially, I guess, the economic divisions that apartheid created have not been healed. The laws have changed, but the system that was set up is not hugely transformed. I mean, it has changed, but not sufficiently. Yeah, it's a very strange thing to be born into. I mean, every child that arrives in the world is taught how the world works, what is right, what's wrong, what the morality and the code of conduct is in that particular society. And white South Africans born into a very, very unnatural system are obviously taught that the system is natural. So you either take that in and believe that and continue to perpetuate this distorted system, or you begin to question in yourself, is this right? Does this make moral sense? But that kind of questioning is not only a questioning of yourself and your society, it becomes a questioning of your own family, if indeed they believe these things and have transmitted them to you as the right thing. So it becomes a very, very complicated process where your guilt and your self-blame and your self-doubt become very, very big personal factors. Because, of course, on one hand, you love your family. It's biological to love your parents. Even if they do terrible things to you, we tend to love them. But you can hate them at the same time. I mean, this is a very human thing, to love and hate at exactly the same time. One of the reasons I'm not terribly threatened by AI, that's an incidental remark, is that I think computers find it very hard to comprehend this duality, while human beings feel it naturally. But yeah, growing up in Pretoria in the 1960s and 70s was not a pleasant experience, not one that left a warm glow, the kind of warm glow that we might hope childhood would leave in us. Instead, yeah, it left many scars, and some of them last. So, yeah, I can't speak to Ukrainians' relationship with Russia and the kind of conflicts that sets up. But I do think it's true that most white South Africans grow up with a very, very troubled and conflicted sense of what it means to belong to a country like South Africa, where for a very long time I think the moral code was completely inverted.
That's very, very, very profound and interesting, because we were talking before this event that, for example, Nelson Mandela is perceived by some people in Ukraine as a kind of as a figure to follow, meaning the transformation that has happened. And even on Maidan, we had, maybe our colleagues remember, one of the leaders of Maidan, I think it was Yatsenyuk, who was quoting Mandela, this phrase that it all seems to be impossible until it's done. And it was one of the slogans that Ukrainians internalized. But you're talking about this legacy, the legacy that still exists in the society. How to overcome this legacy? Because for us, it is also that legacy that Ukrainians are facing, not in these terms, not in the racial terms, but in the terms of, okay, we understand that lots of people who privatized companies in the 90s, 2000s were the heirs of that Soviet regime, were either people from the Communist Party or the people from the big industries, and in many ways they formed this class that we are now called oligarchs. So the society is, you cannot change society through revolutions. You need a very, very slow process of evolution. Do you believe in that evolution, or you rather, giving your experiences, you're rather skeptical?
No, I mean, I think it's obvious that societies do change, and they can change profoundly. I think history tends to work, the wheels of history grind very slowly, but then sometimes there is a slippage or a convulsion, and the change that comes is very, very fast. We've been through some major historical convulsions in South Africa in my lifetime, which is partly what gave rise to the writing of my novel, as if time was sped up in a way. I mean, when I was growing up, the idea that the ANC would be unbanned, that Nelson Mandela would be released from jail, that we would have a black president in South Africa, never happened.
Can we decipher what ANC means for the audience?
Sorry, ANC, African National Congress, is the ruling party in South Africa, but they were also the resistance movement for decades and decades in South Africa. And Nelson Mandela was their imprisoned head. He went to jail for 27 years on charges of treason. I mean, Mandela is a national myth. And I think at times of great change, countries need mythical figures to hold on to and to bind them. Thank God for the myth of Mandela, but he was also a human being. I think it's now becoming possible, really, to look at the person, I mean, the incredibly impressive person that he was, as opposed to the myth. I think at last we are able to move past the reverence and begin to be a little more critical. The younger generations in South Africa now, I mean, it's certainly not universal, but for a lot of young people in South Africa, the perception is that Nelson Mandela did not go far enough in his settlement with the white regime. That, I mean, some people are angry enough to call him a sellout. I certainly don't believe that, and if you look at his life and what he went through, it's very, very hard to pin a label like that on somebody who's given up really everything. But yeah, we have a long way to go still, but without Mandela and that very, very hopeful moment that carried us through from the old white government to our inclusive democratic system now, I think our country would be in dire trouble. We may be in dire trouble now, but it's of a different sort.
Anjan, let me come back to Central Africa, but also ask a question about India and connect them in a maybe strange way, but actually a very straightforward way. You describe Central Africa that you reported from as a country where there is a big history of Muslim states that were destroyed, as far as I understand, by the French colonization. And then you describe how Muslim movement, thinking about the past, try to overthrow this basically pro-Western and Christian government, and how now we are in a situation when there is lots of resentment towards the West, towards the French colonialism. And interesting, the important thing is that, yeah, we can look at these countries. We can also look at India, who suffered a lot from the British colonialism, and we discussed it in detail in our meeting a couple of weeks ago. The problem for us, for Ukrainians, is that there is Russia that says, yeah, we are on the side of these guys. We're also the victim of Western colonialism. And then you realize, well, how hypocritical it is. Because first, Russia itself has been an empire since at least 15th, 16th century. At the same time, when European empires were enlarging, it has built not a maritime empire, but continental empire with certain, of course, differences, but certain similarities. And second, it has never been colonized by the West. It was probably colonized by some Western ideas, which were turned into their opposites, like with Russian communism. So Russian discourse, of course I can understand the Indian feeling about British colonialism, or I can understand Central African feeling about French colonialism, or Congolese feeling about Belgian colonialism. But Russia is just hypocritically placed with this. What do you think?
Yes, so I guess, colonial discourse is such a complicated thing, and different power structures use it in different ways, and we see this in literature, we see this in politics. In India, for example, in the south of India, we see the north. I'm from the south of India, and many people from my part of India sees the north as a colonial force, and the imposition of Hindi as the national language, which is Hindi is a language from the north. They see this as an internal colonialism. And so their solution is, if I meet an Indian from North India, often we'll speak in English to them. We'd prefer to speak in English than to speak an indigenous Indian language, because the animosity is greater with your neighbor, and you prefer to pick the language of an outsider. So in a weird way, colonial conquest or rule, it can also be a unifying force. It gives you an identity. It gives you for many, I don't speak many, we have 25 or 30 languages in India. I don't speak almost all of them. I only speak 2. So the chances are, if I meet another Indian, we either speak we speak in English, right? They don't speak my language and I don't speak theirs. But yes, I guess you're raising an interesting point. I think, in the Central African Republic in particular, Russia is coming in as a force that is replacing Western colonial powers. So France, in the Central African Republic recently, or a few years ago, France, which has historically been a force there, pulled out its troops, pulled out its political officers, and it left a void, and Russia stepped into that void, and the Wagner group moved in and has now provided security training for the president of the Central African Republic. It's been, it's installed a number of mines. It's extracting a lot of wealth. And apparently the wealth it's extracting from the Central African Republic is being used to recruit and spend on the war in Ukraine. So it's, I think that's also something interesting. This Central African Republic, which, by the way, you mentioned, when I told my editors I'm going to the Central African Republic, they asked me which Central African Republic. They didn't know it was a country. And so it's this place that can seem so remote and isolated, but it's connected to the war here in a very direct way through a neo-colonial extraction, a process of extraction. And I think I feel like a theme through your questions and our discussion here has been the relative silence, the ignorance in the world of many of the war crimes, of many of the conflicts that occur. And personally, I feel, after now being a journalist for 20 years in such places, I feel that countries in the global south need to stop complaining about Western media, stop complaining that Western media are not paying attention to these conflicts, and need to start their own media and need to propagate their own media, which is why I was so pleased to hear mentions of the Global South. I'm pleased to be here because I feel that these connections between Global South countries are very important now. If India and South Africa and Ukraine and the Central African Republic don't elevate the value of our people, I don't think waiting for Western media to recognize and value our people adequately is going to lead to anything fruitful.
We'll discuss this, I hope, also in detail. But I also do think that there is we can compete whose colonialism is worse, right? British colonialism or French colonialism or Turkish colonialism? Well, Turkey, by the way, also has this, plays into this post-colonial thing, but frankly speaking, Erdogan is just rebuilding its empire, and it sounds from the countries like Russia, it sounds in particularly hypocritical when through the language of decolonization, they actually promote recolonization, and that's the most horrible thing. I think that. We need to take decolonization seriously, and we need to understand that this process is not over. It has lots of problems. It has lots of impediments and barriers, and we can have, we're dealing with Western empires, we're dealing with Eastern empires, we're dealing with Southern empires, we are dealing with Western slavery, we are dealing with Christian slavery, we are dealing with Muslim slavery. I mean, there are lots of different things in the world. But we should be very careful about some, subjects who are saying, we will help you to decolonize you, but actually are recolonizing and just substitute one imperial power with another. Maybe my last question, and I'm sorry it will be rather geopolitical, but maybe we can turn into another story, and then we will talk with the audience. Geopolitical is that there is this famous BRICS alliance, right? And it seems that it is trying to unify these countries which are not happy with the Western domination. And in this BRICS alliance, there is also Russia, there is China, there is India, there is South Africa, there is Brazil. And my problem is that, again, this is rather sometimes leads to the new divisions of the world rather than, bringing the gaps. And our trouble of Ukrainians is sometimes that to see the messages from BRICS countries as just anti-Western messages. Okay, West says A, and then we will say non-A. West says we will support Ukraine. We will say no, we'll not support Ukraine. I feel it very, very troubling. What do you think? Damon.
I agree with you.
Okay, end of discussion.
No, I do agree with you, and I think on the one hand, the idealism of a new world order is to be applauded and encouraged. And on the other, I think it's naive to believe that new order, if that's the right term, comes with a new political morality. I think it's exactly as you articulated, that it brings new divisions and maybe new allegiances. I mean, it's not accidental. I think that the countries in the BRICS grouping seem to me to be the countries that have taken a neutral or non-aligned stance where Ukraine is concerned. No doubt placating Russia. I think in the case of South Africa, the historical ties between our governing party, the ANC, and Russia go back a very long way. When the ANC was a resistance movement, Russia contributed financially and gave training, help, education to a lot of the fighters who had left South Africa, gone into exile, and were coming back to fight. And I would speculate that South Africa's supposed neutrality is about that. It's an historical debt. It's just a debt to a different power, and it creates a whole new moral question. So great, we're not with America anymore, but who are we with? It's not reassuring always, and I think it's just as well to keep one's eyes open, even as you move into maybe some new idealistic world order, to keep one's eyes open to the fact that in the end, it is perhaps human nature and in the nature of every nation to seek as much power for itself as possible. What should power do except want to amplify itself? and that it's part of our human endeavor. I certainly see that as a writer to, in one way or another, push back against that appetite for power.
Anjan?
Yeah, sure. I guess you'd asked why I came here, and I think, I want to answer that with a bit more clarity. Big reason for why I do the work that I do is that in these situations of conflict, I find extraordinary people. In these, sometimes from the outside, it can seem very dark, these places, and very hopeless, these situations. But whenever you travel in, you find extraordinary people. In Mexico, where I'm working, they're environmental defenders, they're protecting ecosystems, risking their lives. And I see part of my work is telling their stories, because many of the people I meet, and I've had that feeling here as well a little bit in some cases, many of the people I work with and I meet, I feel there's a good chance they might soon be dead because of the work that they do, because they give themselves to a cause. And here I've felt that a little bit because I'm hearing that in the summer there'll be a new recruitment drive. There'll be a new people will be have to go to the front line of the war, where that question becomes much more stark and much more present. But yes, I think part of to your question about imperialism, I think part of the challenge is to tell stories and create myths that challenge the imperial myths, and I think that's a very important function of the work of journalists, the work of storytellers, to provide people with stories that give them hope, or make them question, or make them reflect on certain on the power structures or certain forces at play. And so, in this, I guess I would just answer. I would say that I'm answering your question in that way, where I acknowledge all those imperial dynamics at play, but I see that there's a role that I can also play in this power dynamic, and there's a way I can contribute. I think stories are incredibly important. I think imperial powers often want us to feel a sense of hopelessness, and that was what I felt this morning. I felt when we went to the basement where all those people were kept for 300 days, it occurred to me, there must have been many, many points during those days when, without knowing when they'll leave, they must have thought, this is it, I'm going to die here, my life's going to be over, and they had this impulse to write on the walls, write their names, write the names of those who had been killed, those they had buried, who had died with them. There's some impulse to sort of to say that I was here, I had these thoughts, that I existed, some to leave some kind of legacy, however small. And I feel that's a big part of the work that I do, because often the people that I'm meeting, they're doing very brave work. They have no time to sit down and write down what they're living and doing. And so I see that by traveling to these zones of conflict and telling their stories, I can play some kind of useful role. Because after they're gone, whether it's tomorrow or in a year or 3 years, or if they live a long time, at least their story can live on and inspire other people.
Yeah, I do think the resistance to this imperialism starts with the statement "I can," and then it leads to the statement "I should." Because if you're living in a statement "I cannot," then you will never act. I want to bring to our guests, other guests from South Africa, is Andrew Brown, writer and lawyer, and Peter Fabricius, a journalist. Maybe you have just a few remarks to add?
Thank you for having us and for this opportunity, and thank you to PEN Ukraine for organizing such an extraordinary tour for us. Just to follow on from something that Anjan said about reporting, the common thinking is that in 2024, because of social media, because everyone has a cell phone, we know that much more reliably about what is happening on the ground. So the moment the first Russian tank enters in the invasion, it is filmed by someone and we can then see it on CNN. And so the thinking is that we have greater clarity than perhaps one did in the Vietnam War or in World War II, that we know what's going on. And my frustration is that I find exactly the opposite. I find that we are inundated with visual imagery, but with it comes a political agenda in reporting, and that you can't rely on what you're being told in mainstream media. Yes, you might have the imagery, but you don't know what the imagery means, and you're being fed a particular line. I consider myself to be an educated South African. My friends are educated South Africans. We all have political interest. We all watch the news. We might watch different news broadcasters, but we all have an interest in it. The level of my ignorance about what was happening in Ukraine is humbling and staggering to me. And I think it's only by being in a place where you meet people, where you can talk to people. And I think this morning was a superb example of that. To meet a survivor and smell what the basement smells like, see what it looks like, feel how cold it is, hear his stories. I now understand properly, I think, with clarity, what happened in that small moment in time. And I think we need more of that. We need reporting of the kind of reporting that Anjan is talking about, on the ground, honest, investigative reporting that we can rely on. So I would really, I would just support what he's been saying.
Thank you. Peter?
Yeah, thanks very much for the invitation. It's been a fascinating trip. If I could just add to the discussion about BRICS, I mean, I think apart from the fact that it's creating perhaps a new sort of polarity in the world, there's something fundamentally wrong conceptually about seeing it as a sort of an organization of the global South, since at the heart of it are the two very major powers, Russia and China, which can hardly be characterized as countries of the South, even though I think sometimes they like to blur the definitions and see themselves that way. And so last year we had, for example, an expansion of BRICS to include some reasonable countries, but also Iran, which is a country that also has a dubious role as supporting Russia in the war against Ukraine with weapons and so on. So it's hardly a non-aligned. There's lots of conceptual confusion and blurring of definitions, and although maybe the BRICS doesn't explicitly ever claim to be like a club of the non-aligned, that is the sort of way it's often conveyed. The other thing I think I'd like to add is that there's part of the non-aligned sort of position is that we want no truck with a war in distant Europe. You guys haven't shown much useful interest in our wars. But what we're seeing also in Africa with the spread of Wagner backing up, military juntas in the Sahel and so on, is that Russia is spreading its a rather malign influence in Africa, and so it's not quite as distant an issue as it's often claimed to be by those who firmly advocate a sort of a non-aligned position on the war. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming, and I think you formulated very well the sense of this coming is this, presence and ability to physically touch this reality, and I really hope that you will bring the stories farther to your countries. And I think these conversations are also very important, and they will be listened by the thousands of people around the world, and I hope also in your countries, because I think we tried to connect our societies a little bit more. So Anjan and Damon and Andrew and Peter, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I also want to thank Pan-Ukraine team and Anya and Maxim and Anya and Tanya and Nastya and maybe Alisa. Alisa is here, no? And who organized, Anya and Maxim primarily, and Tanya, who organized this trip. And this is probably, these trips to Yahidne is probably the most important part of the trip. Our conversation are important as well, but the fact that you have seen it and talked to people is so important. Thank you so much.
This was a podcast by UkraineWorld, a multilingual website about Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko, I'm Ukrainian philosopher and chief editor of UkraineWorld. You can support our work at patreon.com/UkraineWorld. We provide exclusive content for our patrons. You can also support our volunteer trips to the front lines at PayPal, ukraine.resisting@gmail.com. You can find these links in the description of this episode. Stay with us and stand with Ukraine.